I really agree with and emphasize Neil's point here that we need a practical and scientific, meaning rigorous language, to understand the spiritual ideas about ascension and moving up the spiritual ladder, as it were. And I have really dedicated my life to that. My background is electrical engineering, University of Detroit, systems analyst with IBM, and psychophysiology graduate work. And I work with a lot of people that invented biofeedback. So, and now we have turned our sort of sacred geometry and physics of consciousness teaching rather successfully into technology. And once you have technology that confirms the idea, for example, in plasma and in biofeedback, then you have a kind of success that no one can deny. You don't need to wait for governments and universities to agree, because commercial success means that you're doing something that's real. And we're finding that you don't wait for universities and governments. What you do is you make use of the scientific information and create technology that's breakthrough. And our biofeedback technology and our plasma technology are examples. The plasma tech I'm referring to is Therify.net. We're now in about 15 to 20 countries, and it's global. And we're going to take that frequency signature, which we're using in Therify, and talk about it today in terms of what creates ascension in DNA. And then some of the biofeedback websites we're going to be referring to, I will type them in the chat window as well. Flameinmind.com, which is a brainwave biofeedback, which applies this frequency signature of implosive ascension, also in brainwave analysis and reinforced biofeedback, and binaural beats for bliss. And I'll type in that plasma website is Therify.net. Our basic instructional website is fractalfield.com, which all the links includes our Facebook chat, and our fractalu.com, which is parallel to what Neil does here with an online university, is fractalu.com. So we have many projects that are parallel to what Neil's doing here today, and we're happy to be part of it. So let's see if we can start it rather the beginning here. We're trying to understand this spiritual idea of ascension, or even very basically simply calling it, what is spiritual evolution? How would an electrical engineer, which is what I am, how would an electrical engineer define spiritual evolution or ascension? And it turns out there's some very practical and useful answers to these questions from an electrical engineering viewpoint that not only define the process of evolution and ascension, but make it more teachable and more achievable. And so that's why today, in today's presentation, we're going to start with, yes, a bit of the theory of what is conscious evolution and ascension, but we're going to conclude with a major section also on how to do it. And in fact, the conclusion of that will be, I will try to get personal and say, well, what's been my experience in this regard, for example, with Kundalini? So I hope to get up close and personal, not perhaps out of ego, but simply to make this shareable, we need to be personal and present to these ideas. And so I'm willing to be an experiment in sharing, which actually is a bit of a description of my life. So the science, the physics. And I'll pull up the graphics in a minute, but I'd like to kind of look you in the eye for a moment and share my passion about these things. You see, I think that the understanding the universe as a unified field, as we often say, was so much the commitment and passion of Einstein and Jesus. They both believed in oneness, you know. And although Einstein didn't finish his unified field, he didn't ever figure out why an object falls to the ground, for example, the concept of a unified field is the opposite of the kind of schizophrenia which thinks of the fundamental forces, gravity and electromagnetism, for example, as being separate. Thinking of those things as separate, I consider to be schizophrenic and unhealthy. In the same way that it is very unhealthy, in my view, to think of your spiritual life as separate from your physics and your matter and your body. So people who think that their spiritual body is somehow separate from their physical body create problems, serious problems. For one thing, religion wars. For another, people who think their spiritual body is somehow separate often fail to take responsibility for their physical body. And the fact is that only a super happy, healthy physical body even has the possibility of making a spiritual body, which we now realize is simply a coherent ball of charge. That's what your spiritual body is. It's measurable, it's real. We have the power spectra, we have the pictures. We know what a spiritual body is without any doubt at all. And it's a weak electric field, correctly called cold plasma, and it becomes projectable. And to project that ball of plasma, we know exactly how it happens, why it happens, when it happens. We know where it goes after death and why. And these physics are teachable. And sorry, but it is not a mystery. Now, describing this as physics, I insist, does not decrease the beauty and wonder of these things. Rather, it increases the beauty and magic and wonder to see it as physics. For example, learning how a longitudinal wave goes through just about anything, and it's exactly what we've been talking about as God and the divine, gives you all kinds of beautiful ideas of how to participate in what you used to call God and the divine. For example, what we call remote viewing or astral projection. We now know exactly how it works, that you must embed in a longitudinal wave and how longitudinal waves act at a distance, what used to be called scalar or torsional waves, for example. And this is an interesting lesson for our friends at the Monroe Institute, for example. So now we have a language that can teach us exactly how to participate in these things we used to call divine using excellent, precise, measurable power spectrum electrical engineering. And that's a good thing, because it eliminates the need for religion wars. It eliminates the need for personality worship and miracle worship, which I consider a kind of disempowering poison. They're childish, frankly, and they condemn our planet to religion wars. So that's one of many reasons why it's good to think about spiritual things with a pretty disciplined science in mind. And, you know, it isn't that we want to criticize or in any way lessen the beauty of the people we used to worship as saints or spiritual beings. But once we understand the physics of what creates a spiritual being, that makes us their equal. And that's exactly what they want. So we know exactly what a large spiritual being is. It's a large cloud of plasma, which has an implosive center, and it can be steered exactly like a tornado can be steered by a shaman by focusing that center of low pressure and moving it. So the larger the cloud of plasma you can throw your weight around in, the bigger you are as a spiritual being. And I emphasize, this is not subjective. No, it is objective. The GDV, a gas discharge visualization, Karatkov's tools for measuring the aura, are just a beginning for making real and concrete the measurement of spiritual evolution. So, we're saying the universe is comprised of a single contiguous substance. It used to be called the ether. I think more accurately, it is the compressibility of electric charge, where plus and minus compression and rarefaction of the ether is exactly what is defined as plus and minus charge. Most physicists don't know that, but in fact, it works beautifully as an introduction to a unified field theory. For example, then if you know what can implode charge toward center and make centripetal force, then you, unlike Einstein and NASA, could know why an object falls to the ground, because you would know that when waves form a shape like a rose, they create acceleration of that charge wave towards center, which we call the gravity, because the wave fronts add and multiply recursively, constructively on their way toward that center, as I proved in my new equation for the radii of hydrogen, golden ratio, integer exponents times Planck length and time. So I proved that hydrogen is fractal. And that also proves how hydrogen makes gravity, something that Einstein did not know. And when you know that, you have about a dozen different technologies for making propulsion, by the way, which we already have, as we laugh humorously at a planet running around in vehicles propelled by dinosaurs farting, because basically they don't know what propulsion is. And it isn't arbitrary that you need to know what propulsion is, because the same physics for propulsion, which is a vector system, is how you will steer after death and in the lucid dream. You know, how do you steer when you are a ball of charge? Hello, we have the physics for that as well. Remember when when Korotkov, we'll dig out the pictures later. It's at goldenmean.info/immortality. Maybe I should put that up there. I'll put that picture up now. So I'm going to start on some of the images. So, so here is, I'm going to get up a new little site here. This is from one of our articles, goldenmean.info/immortality. And we're talking about how do you steer this ball of plasma, for example, after death. You know, there you are, you're the astronaut, you have to vector navigate, and I'm a ball of charge, and how am I going to steer? So here is Dr. Korotkov right here, looking relatively young with his GDV device, proving that the Tibetans were right, that 10 hours and 36 hours after death is when the capacitive field of your body leaves your body. And if you had a peaceful death, and you really need a peaceful death because you need to charge propagate, you need to plasma propulse. You know, propulsion for that plasma is remote viewing and action at a distance. At any rate, just above here, maybe you can see my cursor. Here's the picture, which in German was called Die Seele, the soul. And this is Korotkov saying, this is what your soul looks like after death, in his book here, Light After Life. And he later goes on to show where this soul goes after death and why. And the short answer to the question is the plasma ball that you are when you're lucid dreaming and when you are dead is exactly like a negative ion wind, which is so healing in a hospital. It is very fragile. And therefore, the plasma ball that is a spirit, for example, is very unable to propagate in a steel or aluminum structure with dead air because the capacitance will dissipate that plasma. For the same reason you will not photograph orbs in that room of electrosmog, dead air, and steel and aluminum. For the same reason that Therify.net, the plasma of our healing technology, is less effective if the room does not have natural material and live air. So this negative ion wind, which we know is fractal and implosive, which is medically proven to be powerfully healing, is the same as the plasma ball that comes from Therify.net in 20 countries and can heal pain very dependably, among many, many other things. At least I can't claim that it heals pain, but other people tell us that. And so we need to understand what it is that enables that propagation of that healing field effect in order to do it better. And we now know, as we all had intuited before, that living architecture is better if your building, your house, is made of biologic materials. You know, living wood, living stone, living fabric, etc. That the more biologic material in your house and the less steel and aluminum, for example, and electrosmog and dead air, the happier you feel. That's obvious. It is biologic architecture. We wrote the curriculum, goldenmean.info/architecture. But the new information is now we know exactly why in physics it is that life force, and therefore your aura, cannot grow in a steel and aluminum dead box. It is because the dielectric constant does not allow the efficiency of the capacitance to resonate. In other words, if you place an insulator between the plates of a capacitor, like a living material versus a dead material, living material has a higher dielectric constant, which means that when you ring the metal plates of that capacitor like a bell with a hammer called voltage, the longer it rings, the higher the dielectric constant. And if you hit a capacitor with a hammer called voltage and it rings forever, that means it's a zero-point energy device and it has a very high dielectric constant. Well, what it means is it's imploding its environment. Well, all that means is that it can propagate a weak charge field efficiently without dissipating that charge field. That's why Steiner correctly taught that children should never touch steel and plastic or synthetic. They should always only touch living material because they cannot become part of your body unless your capacitance, your weak charge field called cold plasma, can propagate through them. So this is going to begin to introduce us to the conditions for the survival of living charge. Example, elemental forces, the undines, the gnomes, the sylphs, the fairies. These things do very fine in nature. This is going to tell you the physics of why Luke Skywalker had to go underground in a cave with lots and lots and lots of nature around before he could learn from Yoda before he could learn how the force could be with you. So to have the force be with you, do not try to do it in a steel and aluminum building full of electrosmog. Sorry, the force is not going to be with you there. And my job is to teach you why, so you can do the right homework. Another example of this is the famous story that so many of the documented yogis in India who have lived to be, 200 to 400 years old, that not one of them did it in a building. No, they all did it in a cave. Why? It was the capacitance, you see? Or when Magdalene's daughter, Sarah, the Egyptian, the Black Madonna, gave birth to Trophimus John in southern France, and he woke up in his grave and lifted the stone cover of his gravestone, the platen, and his knee melted that stone, just like Padmasambhava's hand melted the stone many times on his cave in India. It was his plasma being so strong, and they all accomplished it in stone caves, and not one of them did it in a steel and aluminum building. So you could be beginning to get it, that there's an electrical engineering dynamic which allows the propagation of living charge, and it's real and practical. And then there's a whole nother level to this, which is called how we embed in a longitudinal wave, which is the faster than light goes through just about anything, which is the essence of all of spiritual energy, spiritual literature, spiritual tradition, action at a distance, all these stories, they all depend on longitudinal wave embedding. So we're going to talk about that, because if you know that you need to embed in a longitudinal wave, you can do it right. For example, why does Agnihotra raise your hair, stand right up, only at sunrise and sunset, and cause fertility and heal just about everything? Because that plasma, that flame ball in the Agnihotra pyramid, which is an implosive capacitor, is lit at the right angle to the solar plasma, called conjugate four-wave mixing. In other words, if you get lined up with what the ancients called the four directions correctly, in physics that's called four-wave mixing, how accurately the lasers have to converge in a cube in order to phase conjugate or implode, where the pine cones kiss noses accurately, called conjugation of phases, perfect implosion. And at the center of those pine cones kissing noses, there is a universal wavelength that visualizes the symbol for the Tao. That wavelength at the center of the symbol for the Tao is at the center of those pine cones kissing. And that wavelength is called Planck length in time. And it's very interesting that it's the musical key signature of every wave physics has ever measured. And it doesn't matter if you go 1,000 light years in any direction, it's still the same. There is some agreement here, and the nature of that agreement is caused by longitudinal waves, which are gravity waves, and very few people know that. And we're going to have that conversation. But I get over-enthused. So we're going to start here. This is the longitudinal wave section, but let's start with something more basic. We're going to start with using the metaphor of DNA to understand ascension. So in this process, I'm going to be referring to 3 of my earlier books. This is Alphabet of the Earth Heart, credit to Vincent. And this is the early Alphabet of the Heart. And this was the later book, Implosion's Grand Attractor. In my newest book on this science is called Origins of Biologic Negentropy, which you can see at fractalfield.com. So these are the books I'm referring to. Okay. So what is ascension? Or as someone in Facebook said, what is it that really ascends? Anyway, well, let's see if we can answer that question. Remember now, we have said that everything in the universe is made of a single compressible substance, nothing but motion, nothing but waves, and that compressible substance behaves as a compressible liquid. And what is compressed and rarefied, called the ether sometimes, is in fact charge. And when we have compression versus rarefaction, that's plus or minus charge, quite literally yin and yang. And that is the origin, that is the root descriptor of centripetal versus centrifugal forces, that plus and minus charge toward charge compression versus charge rarefaction. So that's our description of a unified field. And now we want to understand what causes that to become negentropic, which is to say the opposite of entropy, which is to say self-organizing, and ultimately what causes it to become alive and intelligent. First, we're going to use the metaphor of the geometry of DNA to talk about that, and then we're going to use heart harmonics and brain harmonics to finish that conversation. And the link between the DNA geometry and the heart harmonics is when I suggested the first measurement be made that coherent heart harmonics cause DNA to braid measurably. Glenn Ryan made the measurements. We're going to look at that in a moment at my suggestion. So, the braiding algorithm in DNA is a good introduction to the concept of ascension. Remember, we are saying that the number of dimensions is never anything more than the number of axes of spin symmetry of charge which can be superposed rotating. In other words, if you rotate charge in 3 axes, let's visualize as cubic for the moment, although tetracube really has 7, but let's talk about 3. If you had 3 axes of spin in a tetracube, and then you wanted to superpose another axis of spin around that cube, oops, I forgot to bring out my Star Mother kit, goldenmean.info/kit. But you all know that if you rotate a cube, if you tilt a cube up 32 degrees and rotate and blink 5 times, you see a pentagonal dodecahedron, edge length 0.618 golden ratio to that cube. Well, in my view, that is the only possible real definition of a next dimension, because if that standing wave, which is tetracubic, for example, the pi suborbital is tetracubic, and the d and f suborbitals, which are superposed in the electron array, are 5-7 electron spin pairs, which is 10-14 electrons. So the d and f suborbital superposed around the pi suborbital are 10-14 electrons, which is exactly dodecaecosa. And we'll get to those graphics maybe later. Point being that the pi suborbital, which is obviously tetracubic, as any chemist knows, it goes to the next dimension in the df suborbital by rotating another axis of spin around the cube. You take the existing cube, you tilt it 32 degrees, the famous chin angle of things, and you rotate, and now that cube is in the next dimension. It has ascended, in the sense that the number of axes of spin are superposed, and therefore, when you did a frequency analysis of the charge at those nodes, you'd find another harmonic. So the presence of the next harmonic in the cascade indicates how many axes of spin of charge are rotating superposed. That's why a doctor finds out if you have an immune system and how long you're going to live. It's the most direct way to find out the health of your immune system and predict whether you're going to live or die. The most direct way to do it is you take the harmonics of your heart rate variability, HRV, and if the harmonics are inclusive, you have an immune system. If the harmonics are exclusive, your heart is stuck at one frequency, you're toast. You're going to be dead within days. It's very simple mathematics. So harmonic inclusiveness is medically proven to measure immune health in heart rate variability. Very few medical doctors who apply that every day know that harmonic inclusive predicts the viability of everything in the universe, atoms, babies, and galaxies. The more harmonics included, the longer they're going to sustain. For example, bioacoustic habitat theory, Bermany-Krause proved, take the harmonic analysis of a forest. If you have harmonic inclusiveness, that forest has an immune system. If the harmonics are leaving the sound of that forest, that means that forest is dying, quite literally. And you can apply that to DNA, atoms, babies, and galaxies. And the point is that harmonic inclusiveness is perfected by golden mean ratio called phase conjugation, because those harmonics, when they interfere with each other, will do so constructively only if their ratio is golden mean. Otherwise, there will be destructive interference. That's why golden mean ratio, phase conjugation, perfects charge implosion and harmonic inclusiveness, because it's the only way a lot of different frequencies can move to one place and constructively interfere, called implosion, or pine cones kissing nose. So, back to DNA. So here's our pretty picture. You see that the length, area, and volume of the DNA ratchet helix, it's a dodecahedron down a helical stairway. The vertical increment of turn is golden mean ratio. The radius of turn is golden mean cubed, and the horizontal increment of turn is golden mean squared. So basically, when the pentadodeca ratchets down a helix, you take that fourth axis of spin and a fifth superposed axis of spin in that thread of dodeca ratchet called the thread of DNA. So now you have 5 axes of superposed charge rotation in the thread that is DNA, all based on golden ratio. Notice at the center of the DNA, here's one ladder of the rung of the DNA, pent, hex, and a golden rectangle. The golden rectangle of each ladder rung core of the codons of DNA, the golden ratio rectangle, the center bond there is hydrogen. And when I did this slide, I didn't know that the radii of hydrogen are golden ratio to Planck. So you have the perfect black hole in the center of this thread of DNA, and that zipper, that black hole at the center, that codon rung, that fractal conjugate hydrogen bond at the center there, right there, is the black hole zipper to making a soul. That's what happens. And what happens there is when the waves conjugate, when the braid on the braid on the braid of the braid is phase coherent, the long wave embeds in the short efficiently and constructively, then all the way down to the Planck length in that hydrogen atom, the pine cones kiss noses accurately and spit out that inertia from transverse to longitudinal compressional. And we're going to show the graphic about that in a moment. So this is the study that Glenn Ryan did at my suggestion. After I showed HeartMath Institute how to do this, we took the harmonics of a coherent heart, someone feeling love here. This is from about 0 to 40 hertz here, the low frequencies of a heart feeling love, and exposing DNA to heart coherence before and after, and I invented the term heart coherence and how to measure it. He measured this distance right here in this graph in the presence of the enzyme responsible for the zipper, which is to say how much braiding was happening, how much the short wave was embedded in the long wave, how much nesting of the short wave in the long was happening in DNA. So basically, your DNA helix braids like a thread into string, into rope, into fat rope, coherently, a braid within a braid. And here's a little animation we have of this. I don't know if you can see that okay. We'd see that there's a thread, but when it braids, now that short wave embeds in a longer and longer wave in DNA. And this is a model of embedding or nesting, where you have the short wave and the long wave and the longer wave. And you see how that's fractality. That particular graphic, the same graphic that describes embedding in DNA, is also used to teach heart rate variability, embedding of the heart rate in the heartbeat, in the breath, in the day, and the week. And that same graph is also used in Feng Shui to teach perfect Feng Shui. It's perfect embedding. So this cascading creates this, if you model this cascade here as a golden ratio spiral down that 60-degree cone in the pent dodeca, it looks like a caduceus. And if you rotate those, you have a pine cone kissing noses right at the center. And so that cascade or caduceus creates the symbol of Hermes, and that implosion launches the longitudinal wave, embeds all of that transverse inertia into compressional longitudinal inertia right at the center of the pine cones kissing noses, where basically DNA radio is then engaged. And when the braid on the braid and the braid is coherent to the longer and longer waves, that braiding becomes broad spectral. And we're going to talk about what that means. Basically, when the longer waves get into DNA, then you have, you have bigger things embedded in the wave mechanics of DNA, like Ride the Long Wave, Uncle Joe. So we have many pictures about that. And most of you have seen this slide where we teach about the fact that if you look at the electrical origins of the heartbeat here, let me see if we can show this here, that this is from the book When Time Breaks Down, The Geometric Origins of Cardiac Arrhythmia by Arthur T. Winfrey. Very technical book in which he's describing where does your heartbeat come from electrically. If you are looking at the shape of the wave, a voltage differential converging to cause your heart to beat, and make a map of that, what it would look like. Well, not only does it look like a donut in a donut, but it looks like a spiral within a spiral that's learning to dimple or turn inside out recursively. So when we said, I would turn myself inside out for you, darling, what you meant was you would teach your heart to implode and gather centripetal force called long wave phi ratio, or lo-fi, or love for short. And actually that's real. That embedded charge implosion in your heart is a rush. And the feeling of love is a rush, and it's centripetal. And love does move mountains. if you properly understand how that embedding works. But actually, there's some suggestions here. Do not attempt to fall in love with an aluminum or steel building, because if you try to implode the charge there, it ain't going to work so good. Another way of talking about it is that if you want to try your bliss process, basically your body needs to implode the charge of its environment, like a zero-point energy device, in the same way that the Therify plasma system implodes the charge of its environment. And if the environment is dead air and electrosmog, and then you're imploding poison. So do not attempt to sustain bliss process in a bad electrical environment. You can do it for a short term if you need to heal someone or do something, etc. But generally, it's easier to take a bridge than to walk on water. So this perfect embedding is called super looping or perfect nesting. The super looping term is used in the heart rate variability literature, thanks to Dr. Irving Dardick, famously in his book, Making Waves, where increasing harmonic inclusiveness in heart rate variability, which also creates a DNA braid, is the way he healed many, many diseases, by simply teaching people, oh, if you're sitting for 4 to 8 hours a day and you don't move, your heart rate loses variability, and that means you're toast. So, he makes a graph of the heart rate variability of your day and then analyzes it and tells you when you need more variability. And by doing that, he healed so many diseases, it was practically illegal. And there was a 2-hour BBC special on overnight long-term heart rate variability analysis. And it used to cost hundreds of dollars to do that. But now, thank goodness, iThrive.com, our HRV app, ITHRVE, iThrive.com, you can do overnight long-term heart rate variability analysis and find out when your heart is learning variability, and it's cheap. So we're going to talk more about that. So this is we're talking about the secret of inhabiting tornadoes. If you watched a shaman steer a tornado, you would see that the bioplasmic streamers from the belly of the shaman, who is eating the hucha, which is to say feeling the pain of the tornado, and the pain is only where fractality is bleeding. It's the only definition of pain. So where fractality bleeds charge, you call that pain. If you restore that implosive compression, pain goes away, and that is a summary of Therify.net plasma, where short-term pain we can deal with often within minutes, and long-term pain in 5 to 15 sessions in many, but not all cases, but we're able to help people with that simple principle. Restored implosive charge compression is the electrical opposite of pain. So, as the Andromedans said, the only pain you feel is the love you withhold. Well, it's also the only pain you feel is the embedding. You withhold the implosion. The failure to see everything as inside you, which is to say, imploding. So this brings up this conversation about there is no junk DNA. In fact, the spacing between the braiding is what was called junk DNA. In fact, it's critical because it's how the DNA actually creates the charge implosion by that musical phase discipline, locking the short wave in the long wave, which is why Grammatical Man, Information, Entropy, Language, and Life, the famous book Jeremy Campbell, proved that the context richness of DNA was the braiding algorithm. Hello, it's music, it's embedding, it's shortwave phase coherence to long. So this is an introduction to implosion. How does DNA implode, and why is that ascension? That's the question on the table. That as your DNA gets longer and longer wavelengths with that completed braiding process, see here the longer wave on the right, so as those longer waves become present in the DNA, that means there's more, the phase conjugation at the center of the pine cones kissing noses gets more and more broad spectral, as it is in Therify. What we do to the plasma, we take very long waves, modulate on the megahertz, all accurately, and we create perfect broad spectral phase conjugate implosion, even optical phase conjugation in the plasma, and we create charge implosion. And it's negentropic, it's rejuvenating, it's powerful. It's a simple principle, and it's the drawing of the caduceus from Hermes, and it works. So that charge implosion, we can help with external plasma, which is what Therify is, but nature intended that you do it in your own DNA by learning to make bliss, actually. That's what nature intended, and that is what we intend to talk about. And this is an early slideshow, so we have lots of pictures of how this works in DNA. You got this implosion way, and you see the braiding algorithm. It's an introduction of the Celtic knot, and there's a part of it that turns inside out recursively, which is called pilastration. which is how you make a Klein bottle, for example. And the DNA actually turns inside out, becomes toroidal DNA, circular DNA. Here's from the circular DNA. It's actually the 7th axis of superposed spin. So remember, we had 5 spins, literally, in the thread that's DNA, the dodeca ratchet, 5-axis spin symmetry, 5 dimensions. And then you ascend as the number of harmonics become phase coherent, where you have the braid of the braid of the braid on the braid, thread to string to rope to fat rope, etc. And that braid of the braid of the braid on the braid happens 7 times, co-defined by the 7 spin symmetry axis of the tetrahedra, the tetracube, the cube of space. It's all the 7 arrows, the seventh sign, you know, opening the 7th seal. Well, that's what it is. At the 7th time, your DNA, you open the 7th seal. It's really true. And your DNA implodes, and you embed in that longitudinal, and you can be everywhere at once. And that's called Lord of the Ring. And that's where we're going with this. So this field of coherence made by your DNA, weak electric field, is called a cold plasma field. Remember, plasma is just, it means a cloud of charge. And physics is clear, 99.999% of the universe is plasma. We just say a cloud of charge. We just say a cloud of compressed ether, the compression and rarefaction. So basically everything is plasma, so not surprising. Your aura is made of the same stuff as everything. It's just if it's coherently imploding, then that tornado will be sustainable and you can throw your weight around. But if you're not coherent, you're toast, you dissipate. And so that coherence of that aura field is called your ka, your boat into your underworld. And the amount of coherence there is measurable and it's teachable. So it is true that spiritual evolution and ascension is simply not just how many harmonics in your aura, but even more simple than that, it is how big is your aura, because it won't implode from the short wave to the long wave cascade coherently unless it's golden ratio phase conjugate implosive. So your aura can't get big unless you use golden ratio. So this is from the biophysics literature showing how golden ratio is implemented in DNA, and it's everywhere you look, of course. And this is talking about how that creates an implosive tornado at throat. And this is actually a photomicrograph of toroidal DNA. DNA as a donut, for example. And then we talk about, we're not going to do the alphabet stuff today, but actually the spiral on that torus, if you look from the different viewpoints of the 7 arrows of the tetra, that is what Hebrew and Sanskrit are, which, you see, that goes back to our conversation of how do you steer when you're dead. So it turns out that if you pump a liquid in a spiral on a torus accurately with high inertia, it could be a liquid or it could be flux, magnetic flux, you create propulsion. You know, NASA and Einstein didn't figure that out, but I'll tell you, in fact, it's how the Vimana and the Nazi Bell flew. So when you visualize a single Hebrew alphabet letter, and here's a couple of them here, this is how they're indexed in the 72 permutations, names of God. When you visualize a Hebrew alphabet letter, you're simply controlling the angle of the torus by controlling the tilt angle of that toroidal domain, the Torah, the domain, Dominus Vobiscum. Domain means God for very good reason. It's a charge domain. So by controlling the tilt angle of the torus magnetic donut, which is the electric field of your optical cortex, the hologram from Carl Priegram, by focusing on a single Hebrew letter, you're putting that donut at a particular tilt angle. And if you throw those donuts accurately, there's a bunch of things that happen. If you visualize 2 symbols exactly opposing, like the Ophanim-Enochian ritual, to cast a spell in a room, what happens is those donuts from the 4 direction, Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, or Adonai, the names of God, the donuts converge and implode at center, and they change the air pressure in the room enough that you can blow the doors off, quite literally, and people get dizzy when these rituals are done properly, because the charge implosion is casting a dream spell. It's what a spell is. You created a centripetal field. But more importantly, even perhaps, is that you need to know that when you are an angel, which is a cloud of plasma made of size, or when you are dead, for example, or when you're dreaming, you are a cloud of charge. That's what you are. And if you're a cloud of charge and you want to steer, you better understand something about vector navigation. And vector navigation is simple. It means, well, if I tilt a donut at a particular angle, I will create propulsion in a particular direction. Because when you pump that inertia down that spiral on the torus, it actually makes propulsion. You can make gravity very efficiently that way. That was called impulse drive versus warp drive in Star Wars or Star Trek. The warp drive uses another related principle, which is phase conjugate also. So here's a conversation about toroidal DNA, very famous papers on toroidal DNA. Top-down view, decagon. We'll go through these slides quickly. And this is the star mother. Here's the 5 cubes in the dodeca we were talking about. And here is the rotating dodeca. Our little animation of the rotating dodeca of the model of the universe and the Earth grid being self-similar and fractal. And here is this. This is how to visualize that waveform implosively converging at center. And then here is, we call this Sushin worms. See how these pine cones implode? They take you in the center of this dodeca, turning inside out. And see how the double pine cones converge, and they converge in this dodeca symmetry. So this is an animation of what later became an equation for the radii of hydrogen, actually, which is at the center of DNA. And this is a little introduction to how you might visualize the braiding. Notice that that's actually a dodecahedron down a helix. And if you go up the center of DNA, this is what the view might be like, the womb with a view, as it were. And this, we played that animation. And this is the story of Jodie Foster in the movie Contact. And remember, the vehicle she used was the dodeca, which came from Montauk, actually. And it was basically an implosive vehicle. And that's really what a Merkaba is about. And this is how that becomes the geometry of the Grail, et cetera. We've talked about that. That actually becomes the Grail cup, and the fractality implied in broccoli and living things. And so this is the top-down view. This is a good view. The top-down view of DNA, you have the 10 spirals, and they add and multiply recursively constructively, and there's a slip knot of implosion at center. So that's the wormhole. Now, I think we want to talk more here about how the wave goes propagates from that center, what we're calling longitudinal, in more detail. But first, just to show this slide, you see the longitudinal wave mechanics, the compressional wave. Let's see if we can see this here. The longitudinal wave mechanics, let's see, I was just checking the chat window here. Let me move this out of the way. Sorry about that. The longitudinal wave mechanics are like billiard balls on a string, that if the balls touch each other and you pick up one at one end and bounce it, then a billion billiard balls down the row, one billiard ball will bounce off at the other end, potentially faster than the speed of light. But now if those billiard balls are slightly moved apart by 1 millimeter, then when you bounce one off at this end, it can take light years for a billiard ball to bounce off at the other end. So it's that perfect stillness of that touch locked into that crystal geometry that allows that efficient propagation velocity. And the only geometry that allows that is the only possible three-dimensional fractal, the stellated pentadodeca, DNA, Earth grid, zodiac, which we have in our Star Mother kit pictured at the bottom right. Now that's an introduction to why, not just why the Earth grid and the zodiac and the universe are, science now knows for sure they're pentadodeca, but that if you want your spiritual energy, if you want your plasma, if you want your therapy, if you want your ritual, if you want your birth or death, if you want your Agnihotra to work good, you go to where one of those magnetic lines crossed in that pentadodeca, because it enables you to embed in the longitudinal wave mechanics. For example, when we do remote healing with the therapy, work the plasma, any kind of ritual, it works a lot better if you are at a magnetic line cross, called a jet or et cetera, and the person receiving is a magnetic line cross. It's a DNA radio, it's druid radio. That's how it works. For example, I'll give another very practical example that you can understand this. The very famous military-grade telepathy from the Cozy Rev mirror from Russia, and Korotkov wandered around the planet with them thousands of miles apart. They put these very accurate microwave active metal cylinders, and they would erect this metal cylinder. We later knew that it's because it's a microwave conductor tuned, and that it's microwave active to ADP, by the way, in your DNA, adenosine diphosphate. And in order to get military grade telepathy, when two of these are like thousands of miles apart, the first thing they do is they take out their nanotesla Gauss meter and measure whether they got a magnetic line crossed. Then they set them up, and sure enough, every time, military quality telepathy, better than expensive radio. But it only works where the magnetic lines cross. Why? Because of longitudinal embedding. Now, this is instruction. This is an introduction to remote viewing, active travel, places of power, castanata. It's all about longitudinal embedding. Okay. I think this is the last slide we might do from this series. This is showing why, to get phase conjugation in optics, you must have those lasers precisely in 4-wave mixing. This is the only way the pine cones kiss noses accurately. Remember, making lasers phase conjugate in optics is the first place they ever measured neg entropy, self-organization, time reversal. And remember what they meant by time reversal. It wasn't backwards in time. No, it was very specific. What they meant was you could take disorder back to an earlier state of order only. In other words, you could time reverse rusted steel to unrusted, but you could never do the reverse. You cannot return in time to disorder. No, you can only time reverse to increased order. Very profound idea here. When we make stem cells with the Therify, for example, you need to know that returning things to their past only works if that was increased order and not decreased order. So neg entropy is a co-definition of time reversal. It's very interesting. But anyway, the first time that was measured in physics, phase conjugate optics, is when they did this with lasers. Now, the material within which they caused those lasers to interfere, called a phase conjugate mirror, this is how Nostradamus' coating on the bottom of his cup worked, and this is how the show stone of John Dee worked to call the angels. So you might want to pay attention here. The coating at the bottom of Nostradamus' scrying cup and John Dee's show stone were phase conjugate dielectric materials. That means super high dielectric constant. That means capacitively they were implosive, highly efficient capacitive resonance. And that is the secret of making a phase conjugate mirror. Time reversal, Nostradamus, John Dee, all this fun stuff starts with understanding what a super high dielectric constant is, which is what you have to assemble, barium, yttrium, barium titanate, barium strontium titanate, etc., in the phase conjugate mirror literature. The magic stuff that makes the magic mirror, the magic coating, the zero-point energy device, is this super resonant material. And what does it do? It's very simple. Because it's so charge resonance, perfect environment for charge resonance propagation, efficient charge resonance propagation, the definition of high dielectric constant, means that is what allows the pine cones to complete their kissing noses accurately, the media for the phase conjugate mirror. Now, this is an introduction to why you need to build your house with biological material, and how you make the magic cave, and how you make the magic Therify, the magic plasma, the magic place, and the definition of sacred space, etc. It's a perfectly charged resonant material, which means perfect charge distribution efficiency. This is why, you got to credit, those Hopis almost went to war at the U.S. government the day the U.S. government said they're going to put metal sewage pipes on their burial ground. No. Those Hopis, they knew better, because charge distribution efficiency in that burial ground is ancestral memory. That's why when Karatkov followed the Kogi around to find out where they could make phone calls to ancestors and measured the capacitance of the air, it was very clear, you're not making any phone calls to ancestors if the air is not fractal, which is, say, highly charged distribution efficient or fractal air, which means air that rings like a bell. Very practically, this means if you make a little spark, electric spark, a little spark gap, in very dead air, say in a metal building, that spark will dissipate immediately, and so will your aura, and so will the soul of your child in a metal school building. Versus if you make a little spark of charge in a sacred stone circle or a very good wooden building in good proportion, that spark can propagate and propagate infinitely, and your aura can grow and grow and grow, and your aura can get big. It's that simple, and that's called dielectric constant. And this is our
Choosing compassion
Grail
carefully
animation.
aligns the magnetic field donuts around the heart so that nest dodeca icasa perfect embedding self not self, squirting pineal
There's our
cone through the speed of light into time.
pine cones kissing
creates the future.
noses. There's
And
our
revolving
Grail
that
cup.
spin path to 0 point in the blood, we get the Holy Grail, which has no inside or outside, solves the problem of separateness, contains, self-embeds the Sufi heart within heart, feminine reproductive organs, into that 3D fractal you can zoom in forever and always see the same thing, heart within heart, perfectly self-contained, self-embedded compassion.
I think the tone of my voice there was much younger. And then if you just revolve that Grail cup, you see the origin of the swastika here. That basically just looking at the different views in the spiral. Okay, so then I think we are supposed to conclude this part of this lecture by talking about how this becomes a model for what's happening during Kundalini. And because Kundalini is a description of when your aura starts to get really big, really fast. And it's a real example of ascension. And what it is that shortwave field of coherence in your DNA then goes, the ultraviolet made by the coherent cell metabolism goes up your tailbone and is mediated by the spine liquid pumping in a phonon wave and causes an explosion of sweetness and growth in the crown of your head. And this has been a dominant theme of my life because I started to have a Kundalini when I was about, well, my early 20s, and pretty intense. And at that time, I was adopted here by Itzhak Bentov, who wrote The Stalking the Wild Pendulum on the Biomechanics of Kundalini. And I had just completed electrical engineering and psychophysiology in graduate work. So I was a prime candidate to begin to model what's happening in Kundalini. And we now know it's a very good example of a mechanism of ascension. One example of the way that is ascension is in the way the low frequencies in the spine liquid pump are precisely braided on the ultraviolet, and later, which comes from that blue fire of the cell metabolism, the blue light, which is literally the sex juice of the cell massaged up the spine liquid pump. And also, later we measured, with Bob Dratch's help, the microwave component of Kundalini, where we were able to actually map the places of trauma on the spine by the microwave emissions, tuned largely by adenosine diphosphate, ADP, ATP, the universal wavelength of cell metabolism, and which I later proved that ADP, bond length of about 1.9 angstroms, is precisely integer golden ratio phase conjugate of Planck. In other words, negentropic implosive phase conjugate collapse is not just inhabiting DNA and hydrogen, but it's inhabiting your spine liquid pump, and later here we're going to see brain waves and heart frequencies. So now I'm going to turn this off for a moment. Let's see the next section here. I'm going to stop the screen share 1 second here. So let's see, there's questions here. Do we actually have more than 2 strands of DNA? We just can't see or prove them. Well, what we're saying here is that the double helix that is DNA, you could call it 2 strands, does not change. The number of strands in DNA does not change or increase. That would be childish, and any biophysicist would laugh at a new age woo-woo saying, are there 12 strands in your DNA then? That's crap. No, but it is very accurate and appropriate to say that as your DNA measurably responds to the sound phonon coherence of your heart feeling bliss and love, it's a phonon wave, it means sound in the liquid, the DNA braids within the braid recursively embedding, creating very long wave coherence in the DNA. Now, if you were to take the thread that is, if you take a thread inside a string, braided into a rope, braided into a fat rope, when you started with that thread and you call that thread had 5 axes of spin, we said quite clearly. But now if you took that thread and you braided it into string, you added 1 axis of spin symmetry. Then if you braided that string into rope, you added another, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, etc. So by the time you're done and there was very fat, thick rope, you had a much longer wave, which was now coherent in your DNA, which didn't exist before. Now that you could call that adding a strand. It's more accurately adding a long wave coherence. So the presence of that long wave did not exist in that DNA until it got braided, and the braiding didn't complete itself until you had a lot of bliss. And I mean recurrent bliss is the mechanism to do that. And very much the conclusion of this conversation is how to do and sustain bliss process. So, you know, we could go on and on about the theory of what is ascension, and that was just a little intro, a taste. More fun, maybe more powerful, or perhaps more useful here would be to try to say, how to do it and what does it mean to achieve ascension in terms of hygiene. So the idea in the last little section here was to try to make some suggestions about how you actually do this practically in terms of hygiene. And then finally, maybe I would tell a little bit more of my story, just to tell you one example. I won't say I was entirely successful. I wasn't, but I had some fun. So the how to do this part of this conversation is quite simple. It is achieve bliss or die. You know, bliss means simply charge radiance. And bliss is when your body implodes. Let's see, I'm going to turn on the screen share one more time here. And I'm going to show some of the ways we measure bliss in brain waves. I'm just going to show a little bit from flameinmind.com here. So if I go to flameinmind.com here, yeah, this is the graph I wanted to show you. And I'm going to bring up this preview one here. It's good. So I have on the screen from our newest Brainwave for Bliss technology some examples of me, in this case, having some pretty good bliss experience. This is actually me in the morning. I had a good breakfast. I had some fruit, and it's quiet and sunny and pretty. And, you know, I was having a good morning. And I sat there and I hooked this up and I was finding, oh, our new Brainwaves for Bliss technology is actually working. And so I was blissful, realizing that our brainwave technology for measuring bliss is measuring bliss. And that made me blissful. So that's, you see, measuring here. I had, on the right, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 harmonics in the EEG in golden mean ratio. This is the alpha here at about 8.5 hertz. And here's the theta, very strong at around 5 hertz. And so, and here's the beta. And so that was a cascade that I was having a rush. My brain was imploding, the pine cones were kissing noses, and I was embedding in the longitudinal. I was imploding charge and therefore radiating charge. What I'm saying to you is this is teachable, this is measurable, this is not subjective. And further, in the flameinmind.com here, we have a wonderful technology for using audio cues to help trigger the bliss. So I go to the help instructions section here. And if you look down here, we have a binaural beat sound technology, one of the world's most powerful binaural beat technologies for creating bliss in sound built into the flameinmind.com. By the way, flameinmind.com uses the Muse headset for brainwave measurement for just the input, and then we do the spectrum analysis, and the instructions are there. But the point is that if you make the right pine cone of implosion sound, you can induce bliss experience very powerfully. We think this is the most powerful binaural beat for bliss there is, actually. We encourage you to try. And we did this at our International Therapy Conference here this summer in South France. And I think almost everybody who tried it had a bliss experience, actually. Although many of the people who tried this were also using our new kit, which we're about to come out with, which is a very precise made copper pyramid frame, which is designed electrically to increase that implosion. And if you put that, of course, at a magnetic line cross, your chances of bliss are, et cetera, et cetera. So this story goes on. Now, I'm going to turn off the screen share now. Okay, so we have 2 questions in front of us. What are the practical steps for making bliss? And hey, Dan, if you're so good at this, did you succeed? These are the final questions on our table today. Oh, here I'm looking at the questions in the chat window. This is fun. Can you dovetail your research with Nassim Haramein? What I'm interested is how you get this level of understanding in the knowledge base of the mainstream science. So very, very good. Actually, Nassim did some great work, by the way, proving that golden mean ratio is how you cascade down into black holes and the proton. What we learned is a lot more than Nassim, though. We learned why you need golden ratio to cascade, which is to phase conjugate. And we learned that phase conjugation is the structure of hydrogen. So we went a lot further than Nassim did. And we might say, and I'm not picking, Nassim is wonderful. I'm glad he interested so many people. It's a good thing. But where I think we can also claim success is now we have applied this into plasma and succeeded at therify.net. And we're applying this now to repulsion and energy. And wait till you see what's coming out soon. Implosiongroup.com. We have global partners. We're having lots of fun here. So actually, my answer to your question is, how do you get this knowledge base in the mainstream scientists? I have a very simple answer, and it's kind of funny, actually. My simple answer is, do not wait for them to publish it in their journals, and do not wait for governments and universities to invite you. No, that's crap. No, what you do is build something that works and sell it, and they come marching to your door right and left. And it does, it works fine. My philosophy for years is forget about this patenting business and applying to journals and publishing and waiting for universities and governments to take interest. No, that's crap. The measure of success is the measure of human energy called money. It's appropriate. Money is not evil. And then you use that money to do some good work. And we're using it to do good work. We're sharing. And so that's how this has come to me. We're building stuff, and wait till you see what's next. It's energyme.com. We have energy contracts all over Asia. We have the red sun battery. All kinds of cool stuff is happening. A thermal battery. It's a molten nickel battery that you can power a tractor trailer for a month on the size of a suitcase. And you put that with a new energy generation system, which we think is good. It's the contract's practically written to replace the power supply of the city of San Diego. Oh no, there's going to be attention to mainstream science. And I haven't even got to the part about the carbon nano. So yes, my short answer is, you understand this well, you build the technology, and that puts you in a place of leverage and power. And it's not about waiting for governments and universities. It's about building it and distributing it and being successful. And that is the leverage. And that gives you the privilege then of teaching, because people can't ignore you when it's working. And we're having some fun right now, so I'm a happy camper. But let's get back to the theme on the table, which was, what is the hygiene to do the bliss process? And, okay, Dan, did you succeed yourself? These are the final questions. We've got a few minutes left here. So the generalized instruction is simple. Get a big aura. There is no, it is not complicated. Ascension is simply a name for a process where the number of harmonics of charge rotation superposed increase, and therefore your aura gets big, because the rotations become longer and longer wave. And so the tornado around you gets bigger. It's very simple. You need a big aura. You need a big aura if you have an immune system. You need a big aura if you're a lucid dream, which will tell you if you're going to take memory through death. So you need a big aura to take memory through death. You need a big aura to become what you used to call God, which is simply a big plasma field, which gets around. So you need a big aura. It's simple. Now, remember what we said about the most electromagnetic waves are transverse. They go up and down. But when the pine cones kiss noses, the transverse up and down component of most of all your communications devices are transverse wave. But when you go down the pine cone, the up and down inertia is translated contiguously, called optimized translation of vorticity. When it comes out the end, it becomes longitudinal, compressional, or a scalar wave. And that longitudinal EMF is how, for example, Ingo Swann heated a thermistor with his mind at a distance through a Faraday cage repeatedly in a laboratory, the same way every Cherokee and Bonpo initiate ever had to light a flame with their mind external to their body. So and this is why it's called flameinmind.com. And the way that's done is when the longitudinal waves converge like this, and when they converge in a conjugate geometry, they can create action at a distance. This is the solution to plasma containment. The fusion energy initiative is now solved as soon as they understand how longitudinal waves create action at a distance, because plasma containment is longitudinal interferometry. And longitudinal interferometry is steering tornadoes and steering ghosts and psychokinesis and all this stuff So learn how longitudinal constructive interferometry works, and you will know the secret to every military. You'll know the secret to every psychokinesis. You'll know the secret to steering tornadoes and after death. It's all about longitudinal, the compressional waves converging constructively at a distance. So back to the bliss process. So what's happening then is as your aura becomes more and more large and coherent, the inertia makes the L as an Elohim or phase shift from up and down to longitudinal at the center. And this enables you to lucid dream and take memory through death. And this is the beginning of all psychokinesis, all astral travel, all remote viewing, which is why understanding how you embed your aura in longitudinal fields by gaining inertia at magnetic line crosses. In other words, how to find the sacred space or place of power to grow your aura. So it's all about growing your aura. And we've told this story before that, you know, every time you eat a piece of broccoli, you know, every time you pick out something at the grocery store, you say to your food, when was the last time you felt genetic diversity? And actually what you're saying is how many harmonic inclusiveness, which is to say, has your DNA been set free? Is your DNA imploding? Do you have a soul? It's all the same question. So it's simple. Every time you make a basic decision about your life, the most important question probably to ask is this going to make my aura bigger or smaller? That's not a complicated question. You know, am I going to take a 20-hour drive in the car? Probably this is not going to be good for your aura. That's a metal box. No, you know, simple question. Am I going to eat this junk food, fried food? No, it's going to turn me into a mud puddle. My aura is going to get little. Versus learning how to meditate and focus and be at the still point and eat live food full of charge, etc. So growing your aura defines ascension. Growing your aura is measurable. Remember, you can teach your kids not to use recreational drugs by measuring their aura because you will see the holes, because asymmetry in the implosion at the center caused by recreational drugs is measurable as holes in the aura, GDV. So aura hygiene is the new science of spirit. It's real, it's practical, it's measurable, and it's teachable. So we had previously divided the hygiene for bliss into 4 categories. We called it diet and yoga, that is the kinesthetic of bliss, recognizing the simple physics that if you move your finger in a spiral correctly, that when you reach the center of that spiral, if you did it correctly, you should feel a little tingle in your fingertip. And the reason you feel a tingle in your fingertip, if you complete the spiral motion with the quality of charge implosion called the quality of grace, the finger of God touching man, as it were. The reason you feel that spark is because you imploded charge called Chi, Orgone, Baraka, Shaktipat, or grace. It is cold plasma, quite literally. So once you understand that physics, you can design your yoga. You can move with the quality of grace because you know exactly what you're doing. You are imploding charge. You're attracting the universal collective media of charge, which will come to you only when it's convinced that when those waves land on you, you will immortalize them by having pure intention, which is to say to be a shareable wave. So when you're walking by the mountain, if you're thinking about pure principle and you had a eureka, the whole charge of that mountain will jump onto your body, and may the force be with you, Luke. Because that charge bubble around that mountain knew very well that by joining your aura, it would get immortal only if you had pure intention. Pure intention, electrically measurable as increased phase coherence in EKG and EEG. That's why I'm so hung up on this idea of measuring heart coherence. And our newest article on heart coherence and measurement tool, iThrive.com, I'll put the link in the chat window, hrv-app.com/real heart coherence. We have beautiful film and all the examples there. The very famous heart math mistake, all that story is right there about what real heart coherence is, why you can measure the increase in phase coherence in your EKG just at the moment you said, I love you, if and only if you were telling the truth. Because your heart's ability to radiate coherence is a biological interpreter of whether that wave is shareable. So you cannot tell a lie without your heart coherence go down. It's electrical. It's a way to measure kinesiology. I discovered that. I discovered how to measure it, the second order power spectra. Yes, is this in relation to heart math? Yes, Roland McCready at Heart Math Institute did not know how to take an EKG before I taught him. And then he did not know how to take heart harmonics to measure heart coherence, to measure emotion until I taught him. It's all at that article. And then even when I tried to teach them what heart coherence was, they got it completely wrong. So HeartMath's idea of heart coherence is simply one frequency, 0.1 hertz, which is called the HeartMath mistake. You can read about it there. Because harmonic exclusiveness is the way to kill your heart. Harmonic inclusiveness is the only way your heart gets healthy. And harmonic inclusiveness is the opposite of what HeartMath teaches. And that's called the HeartMath mistake. And that's how they screwed up the definition of coherence, which I tried to teach them. It's all there at the article. It's a fun, I enjoyed teasing Roland McGrady over there. It's a fun little hobby of mine. But the real metaphor is harmonic inclusiveness. Fractality is the opposite of what HeartMath teaches. So teaching you to breathe at just one frequency really is not the solution. And you can discover that all at iThrive.com, which is what that article I have linked here, hrv-app.com/real heart coherence. So that's that story. Now, I see that I have maybe about 10 minutes left here or something like that. And, you know, we can go on and on about the physics and how powerful it is to understand this science. But I thought maybe the last question you should ask me is, Dan, well, if you're so good at this stuff, did you succeed? and how far did you get? You know, am I an example of what I'm teaching? And so I wanted to, by trying to make this a little bit personal, make it maybe a more shareable wave. And what I can tell you is that after when I finished undergraduate school and went to the Gurdjieff School, I was a double Scorpio, and at that time still a virgin, actually. And I had a lot of sting energy. And a long story, karma, my mother might have been in the Grail story from Alsace-Lorraine, and my father was a wonderful, good-hearted farmer from, and so I started having intense Kundalini symptoms doing the sacred gymnastic at the Gurdjieff School in Charlestown, West Virginia, claymont.org. And luckily, I was sort of adopted, as I said, by Bentov, and I turned my Kundalini experiences into a study of the physics of Kundalini, which led me into psychophysiology and biofeedback and all this fun stuff. Now, what did that mean on a practical level? Well, what it meant was that when you sit really still for a long time in a charged space and you're well-nourished and reasonably healthy, and your glands have a certain level of evolution, then this process can kind of go to completion, and you begin to feel this electric aura, and if you have, and it's related to sexual energy, the ultraviolet component begins to go up your tailbone. I actually can feel it right now a little bit, and it begins to feel like a kind of a red hot poker going up your tailbone. And we actually know what that is. There's vestigial horse hairs there, and then there's this spine liquid pump, which pumps that ultraviolet coherently, which is a sacrocranial mechanism of Kundalini. It's all been measured. Bentov's capacitive accelerometrics, I worked in his lab with him. So, in my case, that meant that after a while, I could begin to feel like there was a burning fire, like a red hot poker going from my tailbone and coming out the top of my head. And it was erotic, it was fun, it was powerful, and it was dangerous. It's dangerous because it stresses the mineral to water bond in your body. It accelerates metabolism past the point of. And even Therify.net, our plasma, uses those same frequencies, and it does. It accelerates Kundalini, and it accelerates metabolism, and it accelerates heart rate. And, you know, a little is good, and a lot can be tricky. And that's true of Kundalini. That's true of plasma. That's true of sacred space. There's a word for that's called hormesis. So I began to notice that there was some effect on the environment. You know, on your good days with Kundalini, you do have an effect on cloud formations. It's practical, it's real, it's nothing, it's the same thing Wilhelm Reich discovered. And you have an effect on lots of things in your environment. People around you might get headaches more often because you're bloating, and the phonons are propagating, and bliss is electrically contagious. I mean, there's a lot to this biophysics. But in effect, when you have intense bliss, your DNA becomes more coherent, and you begin to notice things. You notice that you can feel magnetic lines better. So the more bliss you have, the easier it is for you to feel magnetic lines. So I began to be able to feel the ley lines, and got interested in geobiology and worked with the leading geobiologist here, Stephen Cardino in Lausanne, et cetera, et cetera. So you begin to feel these things, and then various, they call them cities. In my case, it was clairaudience. In many cases, it will be clairvoyance. I even had a discussion with my mother near the time of her death where my mother's a famous artist, thelmawinter.com, and she was very notably clairvoyant. She, you can see it in her art. And whereas I inherited a little of that clairaudience, but not the clairvoyance. And I can tell you we know what it is. The ringing in your ears called sangreal that you feel when you're having these bliss experiences. It's in my book, in the latest book, there's actually a chart. So Benthoff measured the ringing in the ears heard by meditators, sangreal, sound current, the song in the blood. And those harmonics, if you tune an audio oscillator and have the bliss meditators, you can actually measure the frequencies of the ring in your ears. And we now know that they're phase conjugate, they're imploding. And the phonon ventricles are imploding, and your ventricle horns are becoming cones, and it's called getting horny, but actually it's conserved sexual momentum as a phonon wave. And that is voices of ancestors. My friend knows, which ancestor is calling, by which ear is ringing, etc. Why is that the voice of ancestors? Well, ancestral memory is this stuff. That's the point. Every Aboriginal can tell you that they live for ancestral memory. There's a survival reason for that. It's the collected survival information library. And ancestral memory is available in certain places, ley lines, song lines, and if you sing to them, you can embed in it. So, for example, my clairaudience, we were living in Waynesville, North Carolina, and we found out our community was actually built on a sacred Cherokee burial ground, which was a sin, and my hair stands up right now talking about it. So the first thing I heard was Cherokee ancestors, actually, and they were talking about the Trail of Tears, and and so a little bit of clairaudience. And I never was disciplined. You need to be very disciplined to interpret these things and have coherence with them. So, and I never really developed that discipline well enough. So I was busy being stuck in my head and doing the science and all that stuff. But yes, because of intense Kundalini, I can talk fast. Because of intense Kundalini, I can feel very big ideas. I'm pretty good at that. And it's all because I began to get a larger aura. It's all because I paid attention to some of these things. Now, if I had paid more attention to diet and some things like that, I would have probably done better. But at least I'm here talking to you today. So I would say maybe one final thing about this as we conclude here. In terms of using Ascension and your bliss big aura to communicate with your environment, I make some final comments. We know that it's very well known that elemental forces are angry with humans for not communicating with them. It's real. You talk to anybody who communicates with elemental forces. Elemental forces are like orbs. They're plasma balls that can survive only in certain environments. It will never be a steel or aluminum building. Never. No. They can survive in environments with a dielectric constant. Now, the elemental forces are things like tornadoes and hurricanes. Hello, this is a big plasma ball. Who is steering them? Hello, nobody. Why? Because we so stupidly, actually the large elemental forces consider the humans to be drunk because we don't talk to them, actually. And we don't talk to them because we don't know what living plasma is. We have all these mystical ideas about God and the divine, but you can't walk out in your backyard and see a plasma donut like a undine or an elemental feeding the life force to your plants. So if you can't talk to them and work with them, and first of all, they're not even going to exist if you're, in an electrosmog nightmare in the big city. But if you're somewhere in nature, start working with the elemental forces, because that is what's going to eventually steer a tornado the size of our planet as the solar wind goes up. So ascension means effectively, eventually you will see through the eye of the sun. And I did want to end with that, actually, that, we started this group called the Solar Heart Community at yahoogroups.com with all these shamans who had literally seen to the eye of the sun. We know the geometry of the eye of the sun. It's the Anu slipknot, 7 spins inside, 5 spins outside, same as the heart of hydrogen. And we know that every shaman who's ever looked through the eyeball of the sun has agreed that the heart of the sun is cool and inviting. It's not warm at all. And we know why, because it's called cold fusion. Fusion actually is what creates that negentropy self-awareness. And that's part of why the sun is the most self-aware being in our solar system and the only way in and out of our solar system. And every extraterrestrial can tell you if the ET arrived as a plasma ball through the heart of the sun, then have a conversation. But if your ET arrived in heavy metal, you know they're from the wrong side of the tracks, and probably you should duck. So the plasma beings who can get it through the heart of the sun are the ones who actually can grow up. And remember, going out through the heart of the sun is not escapism. No, it's called graduating from kindergarten. That's why they call them sun gods, and that's why the Anu was both the name of Enki's father Anu as well as the heart of the sun. Because basically a plasma big enough to inhabit a star is the only way to grow up. And it's the reason you use a fractal of Orion in almost every ancient star map. It's called plasma projection. And plasma projection is the only real definition of remote viewing and astral travel, which is why, you know, the Egyptians believed that their pharaoh had to be fired if he couldn't make rain, and which is why Tutankhamun learned how to make rain. And I have a fragment of that soul memory, and I can make rain on my good days. I cannot stop it, but I have ended a few droughts in my day. Somebody, my friends can tell you, and I'm not very disciplined about it. I think Rolling Thunder could do better. But the point would be that Tutankhamun was a rainmaker because after 100 generations, the yearning of their ancestors at the moment of death was, if I can't make rain, I'm going to get fired as pharaoh. So eventually your kids learn how to make rain. And they used his DNA for that. And the elementals are attractive. It has to do with the physics of precipitation. It's quite an interesting story about the karma. But remember, the Egyptian believed that if their Osiris didn't inhabit the sun, the whole thing was going to fall apart. Well, they were right. Do you see that stars do not make us as a whim? No, stars need something we make, centripetal force, which is why the solar flares changed so dramatically, 11 times measured, when more than 1 million children sang the same song at the same time. Why? Because we made a centripetal something that our star needs. So invitation to become sun god, the real meaning of ascension. I'm going to say thank you very much. Any questions? Happy to be here, Neil, and hope this is a shareable wave. Thank you.